All right, settle in, folks, and let me pour you a virtual cup of coffee because you are not going to believe the story I'm about to tell you. Stick with me till the end because what my grandpa revealed after 99 long years on this earth, well, it's enough to make your head spin right off your shoulders. Asterisk, you won't believe how this story ends. It turns out my whole life, the name I carried, the stories I was told about my grandpa, well, let's just say his final letter blew all of that clean out of the water. My grandpa, Arthur, 99 years old, he was when he finally decided to lay his head down for the last time. 99 years of what I thought was a simple, open book kind of life. Lord have mercy, was I ever wrong? My name is Eleanor, but everyone who knows me calls me Ellie. I'm 65 now. Got a couple of grandkids of my own who keep me on my toes, bless their little hearts. And growing up, Grandpa Arthur was, well, he was everything. He was the smell of pipe tobacco and Old Spice, the sound of a chuckle that could warm you on the coldest Dakota winter day. He wasn't a man of many words, my grandpa, but his eyes, they held a whole universe of kindness. He'd lived through the Depression, fought in the big one, or so we thought, and then settled down with Grandma Rose, raised my daddy, and was just Grandpa, steady as a rock, predictable as sunrise. He had his worn armchair, his dog-eared, Louis L'Amour paperbacks, his garden that he tended with hands gnarled by age, but still surprisingly strong. He'd tell us stories, sure, but they were always about fishing trips or the time he outsmarted a raccoon in the chicken coop. Never anything deep. Nothing that hinted at a whole other life. Or a whole other him. Back in my day, you didn't question your elders too much, especially not a man like Grandpa Arthur. He was a pillar, you know? The kind of man you just assumed had always been Grandpa Arthur from down the lane. He'd lived in the same small house on the edge of town for over 60 years. Everyone knew him. Everyone loved him. He was a fixture like the old town clock or the giant oak tree in the square. So when he passed, peaceful and asleep, it was like a landmark disappearing. Sad, of course, deeply sad, but also expected in a way. 99 is a good long run, a life well lived. Or so I believed. We had the funeral a simple affair, just like he would have wanted. Lots of casseroles and quiet tears. Afterwards, it fell to me and my brother Tom to sort through his things. There wasn't much, really. Grandpa wasn't one for hoarding. Clothes, some old tools, his books, a few photographs of Grandma Rose, who'd passed 10 years prior. It was in his old roll-top desk, a piece of furniture he cherished, tucked away in a dusty pigeonhole behind a stack of old tax returns. That I found it. A thick, creamy envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax, which was odd. Grandpa wasn't a wax seal kind of man. On the front, in his familiar, shaky but neat handwriting, it just said, "For my dearest family. To be opened only after I am gone." My heart did a little flutter kick. Tom was in the other room, arguing with his wife on the phone about who was going to pick up their kids. I almost called him in, but something made me hold back. I just sat there in Grandpa's worn chair that still faintly smelled of him, turning the envelope over and over in my hands. What could it be? Last wishes? Some sentimental poetry? Maybe he'd finally written down that secret recipe for his famous apple pie. Lord, if only it had been that simple. I took a deep breath, my fingers trembling a bit as I carefully broke the seal. Inside, there were several pages, covered in that same shaky script. I pulled out my reading glasses, seems like I need 'em for everything these days, and began to read. My dearest ones, it started. Pretty standard. But then the very next sentence hit me like a physical blow. If you are reading this, then the man you knew as Arthur Miller has finally passed from this world. But before I go to meet my maker, And my beloved Rose, there is a truth I must confess, a burden I have carried for nearly 80 years. My name is not Arthur Miller. I swear on my grave I must have read that line 5 times. My name is not Arthur Miller. What in the Sam Hill was he talking about? I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. My hand flew to my mouth. This had to be some kind of mistake, a bizarre joke. But the handwriting was undeniably his. I looked around the familiar room at the photos on the mantelpiece, Grandpa beaming beside Grandma, Grandpa holding me as a baby. All eyes. Was this gentle, loving man the cornerstone of our family, an imposter? My head was swimming. Was this some kind of senile confusion he'd written down years ago? But the letter felt intentional. Urgent. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, heavy. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears like a runaway drum. I read on, my eyes scanning the page, desperate for an explanation, for something, anything. To make sense of it, he read about a place I'd never heard him mention, a small town in a different state, a life he'd left behind, and then a name. A woman's name. I was born Elias Thorne, the letter continued, and I left behind a life, and a sister named Clara who I was sworn to protect. Elias Thorne, Clara, who were these people? My mind was reeling. A sister? Grandpa Arthur, or Elias, whoever he was an only child. That's what he'd always told us. That's what my daddy had believed his whole life. This wasn't just a little white lie. This was a fundamental rewriting of our entire family history. The floor felt like it was tilting beneath my feet. I felt a wave of nausea. My own grandfather, a man of secrets. It was unthinkable. And if this much was a lie, what else had he hidden from us all these years? The man I knew, the man I loved and mourned, was he even real? I could feel the questions piling up, each one heavier than the last, pressing down on me. This wasn't just a letter. It was a bombshell, and it had just exploded right in the middle of my carefully ordered world. But that, my friends, was only the beginning. If you think that was a shocker, you just wait. The next few lines of that letter, well, they set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. And I mean everything we thought we knew. He spoke of a promise, a debt, and a fear that had haunted him his entire adult life. What could make a man erase his entire past and live a lie for 80 long years? And who, in God's name, was Claire Thorne? Lord have mercy, I tell ya. Those first few minutes after reading that opening, I just sat there, frozen. My whole body felt like it was buzzing, like I'd stuck my finger in a white socket. Elias Thorne, it sounded so foreign. So unlike the simple, homespun Arthur Miller I'd adored. My first instinct, I'm almost ashamed to admit, was to just burn the blasted letter, pretend I'd never seen it. Let Grandpa Arthur rest in peace as the man we thought he was. Wouldn't that be easier? Kinder even? But then I looked at his handwriting again, those shaky, earnest words. A truth I must confess he'd written, a burden I have carried. This wasn't just a casual admission. This was a dying man's plea for understanding, maybe even for help. I finally called Tom back into the room. His face was still flushed from arguing with his wife, but when he saw the look on mine, he stopped short. Ellie, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I have, Tom, I whispered, handing him the letter. Maybe it will have. I watched him read it, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. He's more pragmatic than I am, my brother. Less prone to dramatics. But even he let out a low whistle when he got to the part about the name change and the sister Clara. Elias Thorne, he said, his voice hushed. You've got to be kidding me. Grandpa? Our Grandpa Arthur? He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and something else. Intrigue, maybe? A sister named Clara? He always said he was an only child, that his parents died when he was young. What in the world? That night, sleep was impossible. My mind raced, replaying every memory I had of Grandpa, searching for clues, for any hint of this hidden life. Had there been a flicker of sadness in his eyes sometimes that I dismissed? A hesitation when he spoke of his childhood? Back in my day, children didn't pry into their parents' or grandparents' past like they do now. You just accepted what you were told. But now I felt like a detective in one of those mystery shows. Only the mystery was my own flesh and blood. The letter, as we continued to read it together over the next few days, me, Tom, and eventually our own grown children, David and Sarah, who were just as flabbergasted, painted a fragmented picture. It didn't give all the answers, not by a long shot. It was more like a series of breadcrumbs. Elias Thorne, it turned out, had grown up in a small, struggling mining town in West Virginia, a place called Blackwood Creek, a far cry from the rolling plains of South Dakota he'd called home for most of his adult life. He read of poverty, of hardship, but also of a fierce love for his younger sister, Clara. He was several years older, and after their parents died young. That part, at least, seemed to be true, though the circumstances were vague. He had become her sole protector. I had to get her away, one passage read, the ink a little blurred, as if a tear had fallen there. There were dangers in Blackwood Creek, dangers for a young girl like her, and people I couldn't trust. I made a choice, a hard choice, to ensure her safety, even if it meant disappearing myself. What kind of dangers? What kind of people? The letter was frustratingly short on specifics, almost as if he couldn't bring himself to write them down even after all these years. Was he running from the law? Or from someone more sinister? You won't believe what he hinted at next. He mentioned company men and a debt that could only be paid in blood. Lord, it sounded like something straight out of one of his Western novels. The most pressing part of the letter, the part that really got under my skin and wouldn't let go, was his plea regarding Clara. I never knew what became of her, he wrote. I had to leave so suddenly and cover my tracks so completely. For all these years, I've prayed she found a good life, that she was safe and happy. But the not knowing Ellie, Tom, it has been a torment. I tried to look for her decades ago, when I thought enough time had passed, but it was like she vanished. Too. Or maybe I just didn't know how to look without risking everything. He then gave a description of her, what she looked like as a young woman in the late 1930s, hair like spun moonlight and eyes the color of a summer sky. He wrote, quite poetically for a man I'd always thought of as so practical. He even mentioned a tiny star-shaped birthmark on her left wrist, and then the request that felt like a sacred duty. If it's not too much to ask, if there's any way at all, try to find out what happened to my Clara. See if she lived well. See if she was loved. It's the last thing your old grandpa, no, your old Elias, will ever ask of you. My son, David, who's a bit of a history buff and pretty handy with all that internet stuff, was immediately hooked. West Virginia, huh? Blackwood Creek, Clara Thorne. I can start looking into census records, old newspapers online. It's a long shot, Graham, especially after all this time, but it's not impossible. Sarah, my daughter, was more hesitant. But what if we find something terrible? What if this Clara suffered, or what if Grandpa, Elias, what if he did something bad to make him run? Are we sure we want to open this can of worms? It was a fair question. What if this journey led us to a truth that was even more painful than the not knowing? What if the man we revered had feet of clay so mired in muck we couldn't bear it? Could we handle it? Could I handle it at my age? But then I thought of Grandpa's words, a torment. How could we deny his last wish, especially one that had clearly caused him so much pain? We have to try, sweetie, I told Sarah, my voice firmer than I felt. For him. He carried this for 80 years. The least we can do is try to find some answers. That was the last straw for any doubt I had. We were going to do this. David started his online digging. Blackwood Creek, West Virginia, was practically a ghost town now, he discovered. The coal mine that had been its lifeblood had played out in the 50s. Records were scarce. He found a few mentions of the Thorne name in some old, digitized county records from the 1920s and 30s. A birth certificate for an Elias Thorne, another for a Clara Thorne, listing their parents, Joseph and Mary Thorne. So that much was true. But then nothing. It was like they just evaporated after about 1938. We talked for hours, speculating. Had Clara married and changed her name? Had she moved away? Or had something happened to her in Blackwood Creek? Something related to those dangers Grandpa Elias had mentioned? The not knowing was starting to get to me too. Days turned into a week. David was getting frustrated. It's like hitting a brick wall, Gran. There are no forwarding addresses. No marriage certificates under Clara Thorne that I can find from that area or period that seemed to connect. We were almost ready to give up, to accept that this mystery was too old, too cold. Maybe some secrets were meant to stay buried. I was sitting at my kitchen table one afternoon, rereading the letter for the 10th time, sipping my tea when a particular phrase caught my eye. Grandpa Elias had written, "I left her what little I could with old man Fitzwilliam, who ran the general store." I prayed he'd get it to her. Old man Fitzwilliam, the general store. It was a long shot, a real Hail Mary, but it was something. David. I called out, my voice trembling with a new, faint hope. Did you ever search for a Fitzwilliam in Blackwood Creek? Or records of a general store? He came over, peered at the letter. Fitzwilliam? No, I was focused on Thorne. Let me see. He went back to his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. We waited, the silence in the room punctuated only by the click-clack of keys and my own anxious breathing. After about 10 minutes, he looked up, a strange expression on his face. "Well, I'll be," he said slowly. There was a Fitzwilliam general store in Blackwood Creek. It closed down in the late 60s. But get this. I found a genealogy forum, a really obscure one, for people from that specific county. Someone posted a query a few years back looking for information on their great-grandfather, a Patrick Fitzwilliam, who ran the general store in Blackwood Creek until he retired. My heart leaped. And David continued, a small smile playing on his lips. The person who posted it left a contact email. They live in Charleston, West Virginia. Their name is Fitzwilliam, too. Could it be, after all these decades, a living link to Grandpa Elias's past? A descendant of the very man he'd entrusted with a message, or perhaps more for his sister, Clara? It felt too good to be true. But as David typed out an email, explaining who we were and what we were looking for, a shiver of anticipation mixed with a healthy dose of fear ran down my spine. What would this Fitzwilliam descendant know? And would it lead us closer to Clara, or to a truth we weren't prepared for? This felt like a real turning point, folks. But little did I know the answer to that email would throw an entirely new, and frankly terrifying, light on why Elias Thorne had run so far and hidden so deep. You won't believe what happened next. We waited for a reply to David's email with bated breath, as they say. 2 days passed, and I was starting to think it was another dead end. Maybe the email address was old, or the person just wasn't interested in dredging up ancient history for strangers. I was sitting on my porch swing, trying to enjoy the spring sunshine, but mostly just replaying Grandpa's letter in my head, wondering if we were chasing shadows. Then my phone buzzed. It was David. Gran, you need to come over. Now we gotta reply. Lord have mercy, I don't think my old bones have moved that fast in years. I practically flew over to his house. He was sitting at his computer, looking pale. Sarah was beside him, chewing on her thumbnail. Well, I asked, my heart thumping. Like a jackhammer. What did they say? David took a deep breath. The email is from a woman named Susan Fitzwilliam. She's Patrick Fitzwilliam's great-granddaughter, all right. She remembers her own grandmother talking about the old general store in Blackwood Creek and about a young man who left town suddenly, and a girl named Clara. My breath hitched. Clara? She knows about Clara? This was it. This was the connection. Yes, David said, his voice heavy. But Gran, it's not what we expected. Susan said her grandmother told her a story. That was kind of a local legend, or a hushed-up scandal, depending on who you asked. About the Thorne siblings. Go on, I urged, though a knot of dread was tightening in my stomach. If you think the name change was shocking, hold on to your hats, because this was a whole other kettle of fish. Susan Fitzwilliam, in her email, explained that her great-grandfather, Patrick, had indeed known Elias and Clara Thorne. He liked them both. Elias, she wrote, was a hard worker, fiercely protective of Clara after their parents passed from the influenza that swept through those hollows. Clara was described as sweet, but also spirited. The dangers Elias had mentioned in his letter, according to the Fitzwilliam family lore, were very real. Blackwood Creek, like many mining towns back then, was practically owned company, a ruthless outfit called Black Mountain Mining. And the head man, a fellow named Jedediah Black, well, he was apparently a tyrant. He had his eye on Clara Thorne. Susan wrote that Jedediah Black was known for taking what he wanted. David read, his voice grim. And he wanted Clara. He was much older, a widower, and known for his cruelty. Elias knew that if Black decided to claim Clara, there was little anyone in that town could do to stop him. The lawmen were on the company payroll. I felt sick. My poor grandpa. Elias, he wasn't just running from poverty. He was running too. Save his sister from a monster. The debt that could only be paid in blood, he'd mentioned. Was it a threat from Black? But what happened to Clara? I whispered. Did he get her away? David scrolled down the email. This is where it gets complicated, Gran, and upsetting. According to Susan's grandmother, Elias had a plan. He'd saved up a little money, and he was going to send Clara away to live with a distant aunt in Ohio. He entrusted the money and a letter for Clara explaining everything to Patrick Fitzwilliam, because he knew the store was a central point, and Patrick was a decent man. Elias planned to create a diversion, make it look like he was the one skipping town for some other reason, to draw Black's attention away from Clara until she was safely gone. So, did it work? Sarah asked, her voice barely a breath. David shook his head slowly. No, it seems Jedediah Black got wind of it somehow. Or maybe he just got impatient. The night Elias was supposed to make his move, Black and some of his men showed up at the Thorne cabin. There was a confrontation. Oh, Lord. I closed my eyes, bracing myself. Susan's grandmother said there were shouts, a struggle. Elias fought them. He managed to buy Clara enough time to slip out the back and run to the Fitzwilliam store, terrified. Patrick hit her, but Elias was badly beaten, and then he vanished. Vanished? I echoed. But he wrote the letter as Arthur Miller. He got away. Yes, David said. But no one in Blackwood Creek knew that for sure, at least not for a long time. They thought Black's men might have disposed of him permanently. That was the story that went around. Jedediah Black, furious that Clara had escaped him and that Elias had defied him, put the word out that Elias Thorne was a wanted man, a thief, an agitator, whatever lie he could concoct. He made it impossible for Elias to ever come back, even if he was alive, so that's why he changed his name. That's why he'd been so meticulous about covering his tracks. He wasn't just protecting Clara, he was protecting himself from a powerful, vindictive man. The debt that could only be paid in blood was likely Jedediah Black's vow of revenge. My grandpa had been a fugitive, living under an assumed name, not because he was a criminal, but because he was a hero. A wave of profound sadness mixed with an immense pride washed over me. The gentle man I knew had a core of steel I'd never suspected. But what about Clara? I asked, my voice hoarse. What happened to her after she ran to the store? Patrick Fitzwilliam did get her out of Blackwood Creek, David continued, reading from Susan's email. He used the money Elias had left and some of his own to send her on a bus to that aunt in Ohio, just as Elias had planned. He even gave her the letter Elias had left for her. A sigh of relief escaped me, so she got away. She was safe. But here's the thing, Gran, David said, looking up, and his expression told me this wasn't the end of the shocking revelations. Susan said her grandmother always felt a deep sadness about Clara because after she left for Ohio, they never heard from her directly again. The aunt eventually wrote to Patrick Fitzwilliam a year or so later saying Clara had, well, she'd run off. Run off? I frowned. Run off where? With whom? The aunt didn't know. She just disappeared. One day she was there, quiet and sad, and the next she was gone. The aunt assumed she'd gone to try and find Elias, or maybe just couldn't bear to stay where she was with all the trauma. My heart sank. So Elias never knew Clara made it to Ohio, and then he never knew she'd run off from there. And Clara, thinking Elias might be dead or in terrible trouble, ran off looking for him, or perhaps just to escape her own grief. Two siblings, torn apart by circumstance and evil, each likely believing the other was lost or worse. The tragedy of it was almost too much to bear. 80 years of not knowing. 80 years of that torment Grandpa Elias had written about Susan. Fitzwilliam ended her email by saying she didn't know anything more about Clara. The trail went cold in Ohio, but she did offer one more piece of information. My grandmother kept a small, locked box that she said belonged to Elias Thorne. Patrick had held on to it, hoping Elias might one day return or send word. When he passed, it went to my grandmother. She never opened it. She said it wasn't hers to open. I still have it. It's just an old wooden box, not very big. I don't know what's inside. An old wooden box belonging to Elias Thorne, left behind in Blackwood Creek. What could be in it? Mementos? More clues? I felt a surge of adrenaline. We had to see that box. David, I said, ask Susan if we can meet her, if we can see that box. Already. Did, Gran? He grinned faintly. She said she lives in Charleston, which is a good 5-hour drive from where Blackwood Creek used to be, but she'd be willing to meet us. She even offered to drive to a halfway point if we make the trip to West Virginia. A trip to West Virginia. It sounded like a monumental undertaking. I hadn't traveled much beyond our state borders in years, but how could we not go? This box felt like it could hold the key to understanding everything, maybe even to finding what happened to Clara. We're going, I declared. Tom, who'd been listening quietly, just nodded. Sarah looked nervous but determined. But what if the box is empty, Gran? Sarah asked. Or just old papers that don't mean anything? Then it's empty, sweetie. I said, but we have to look. We owe it to Grandpa Elias, and we owe it to Clara. The thought of that little wooden box, sitting unopened for 80 years, sent shivers down my spine. What secrets did it hold? Would it bring us closer to Clara, or would it just deepen the mystery? And what would it feel like to hold something that my grandpa, as a young man in desperate circumstances, had last touched? The journey to West Virginia felt like a pilgrimage, a step into a past that was rapidly becoming more real and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. Little did I know that what we'd find in connection to that box wouldn't just be old papers. Oh no, it would be something far more tangible and far more shocking than any of us were prepared for. Something that would make us question if Clara Thorne ever truly wanted to be found at all. So there we were, a few weeks later, crammed into Tom's SUV on our way to West Virginia. Me, Tom, David, and Sarah, the four of us on a quest for a ghost named Clara, and a truth about a grandpa we were only just beginning to know. I tell. Yeah, I hadn't been on a road trip like that since my own kids were little and we'd pile into the station wagon to visit distant cousins. This trip, though, felt heavier, charged with an almost unbearable anticipation. What would we find? What secrets was that old wooden box still guarding after all these years? If you think this story's been a roller coaster so far, buckle up, because the biggest loops and drops were still to come. We met Susan Fitzwilliam in a quiet little diner in a town that was, as promised, about halfway between Charleston and where we were staying. She was a pleasant woman, maybe in her late 50s, with kind eyes that reminded me a little of the way Grandpa Elias's used to crinkle at the corners when he smiled. She had the box with her. It was small, she'd said, made of dark, scarred wood with a simple brass latch that was tarnished with age. It wasn't locked with a key, but the latch was stiff, as if it hadn't been opened in generations. My hands were trembling as she placed it on the table between us. My grandmother told me this was Elias Thorne's, Susan said softly. She always hoped he'd come back for it. Or that word would come from Clara. She felt so bad for them both. For a moment, none of us spoke. It felt like a sacred object, a tangible link to that desperate night 80 years ago. David finally reached out and, with a bit of effort, unhooked the latch. He lifted the lid dot inside. Nestled on a bed of faded velvet were just a few items. A small, worn, leather-bound journal, a tiny, tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain, and a folded piece of paper that looked like a formal document. There was no money, no hidden treasure in the traditional sense. My heart sank a little. Was this it? David carefully picked up the journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded in places, but the handwriting, though younger and firmer, was unmistakably Grandpa Elias's. It's like a diary, David murmured, carefully turning a page. He writes about his parents, about the mine, about Clara. We spent the next hour in that diner, Susan patiently sipping her coffee while we pored over the contents of the box. The journal was heartbreaking. It detailed Elias's fears for Clara, his growing desperation as Jedediah Black's advances became more overt. He wrote of his plan to send her away, his love for her shining through every word. She is all I have left of sunshine in this dark place, one entry read. I would give my life to see her safe and free. And he nearly had. The locket was next. It was one of those that opens up. I fumbled with the tiny clasp and it sprang open. Inside, on one side, was a miniature, faded photograph of a young man with earnest eyes and dark hair. Elias, undoubtedly. And on the other, a smiling young woman with light hair and a distinct, intelligent gaze. Clara, I whispered, tracing her tiny face with my fingertip. There, on her wrist in the photo, almost too small to see, was a faint mark. Could it be the star-shaped birthmark Elias had mentioned in his letter? Then the folded paper. Sarah picked it up. As she unfolded it, her eyes widened. Graham, Tom, David, you need to see this. It was a birth certificate, but not for Elias and not for Clara. It was for a baby girl born in Blackwood Creek, West Virginia, in 1939, a year after Elias had fled and Clara had been sent to Ohio. The baby's name was listed as Alara Rose Thorne. Mother, Clara Thorne. Father, unknown. Lord have mercy. I felt the blood drain from my face. Clara had a child, a daughter, born after she supposedly ran off from the aunt in Ohio. But the birth certificate was from Blackwood Creek. How could that be? Did she come back? Wait a minute, David said, his mind working fast. The aunt in Ohio said Clara ran off. What if she didn't just run off aimlessly? What if she ran back to Blackwood Creek, thinking Elias might still be there, or trying to find out what happened to him? But if Jedediah Black was still there, and still looking for her, she couldn't have stayed there openly. Tom finished the thought. Not with the baby, his baby, if Black was the father. The father, unknown, on the certificate suddenly loomed large. Was it Black's child? Had he found her when she returned? Or had she managed to hide, to have the baby in secret, with someone's help? Maybe even Patrick Fitzwilliams? Susan, who had been watching our reactions, cleared her throat. My grandmother, she said slowly. She did mention once, very quietly, that there were rumors. Rumors that Clara Thorne hadn't gone as far as Ohio initially, or that she'd come back for a short while in secret, that she'd been helped by some of the women in the town who despised Jedediah Black. They hid her, and that she'd had a child. But then she vanished again, this time with the baby, and no one knew where. A child, Alara Rose Thorne. Rose, like my own grandmother. Had Elias somehow known or hoped? This changed everything. We weren't just looking for Clara anymore. We were looking for Clara and her daughter, or their descendants. Alara Rose Thorne. David typed the name into his laptop, his fingers flying. Born 1939, West Virginia. He searched for marriage records, death records, census data. Minutes stretched into an eternity, and then he gasped, "Oh my God, I think I found her." We all crowded around the small screen. He'd found a Social Security death index record. Alara Rose McAllister, formerly Thorne, died in 2018. Lived in, of all places, a small town just 2 counties over from where we lived in South Dakota, South Dakota. So close, all these years. McAllister, Sarah breathed. If she married, she might have children, grandchildren. David was already searching, and then there it was. An obituary for Alara Rose McAllister. It mentioned she was survived by one daughter, Grace McAllister. And Grace McAllister, according to a quick online search, was a teacher at a high school in a town called Prairie Ridge. Less than 100 miles from us. Grace McAllister, my grandpa Elias's grandniece, my father's cousin. My cousin, once removed. A living, breathing relative we never knew existed. The rest of that day was a blur. We thanked Susan profusely, my mind still reeling. We drove back towards South Dakota, not home, but straight to Prairie Ridge. It was a long shot, showing up unannounced, but we couldn't wait. David found the address for Grace McAllister online. It was a small, neat house with a porch swing, much like my own. I took a deep breath, my hand clutching the small wooden box, which Susan had insisted we keep. This was it. The end of an 80-year-old mystery. A woman answered the door. She was perhaps in her late 50s, with kind, intelligent eyes and light brown hair, threaded with silver, that waved around her face. And as she looked at us, a polite but questioning smile on her face, I saw it. A faint star-shaped mark on her left wrist. Grace McAllister? I asked, my voice trembling. Yes, she replied. My name is Eleanor Miller, I began. And this is my family. We think our grandfather, Elias Thorne, was your grandmother Clara's brother. The change in her expression was instantaneous. The polite smile vanished, replaced by a look of utter shock, then dawning recognition, then tears. Elias? She whispered, my grandmother. She spoke of him. She thought he was dead. She searched for him her whole life. And then the story truly unraveled. Clara, it turned out, had indeed returned to Blackwood Creek, pregnant and terrified, after hearing rumors that Elias had been killed by Blacksmen. The local women, including Patrick Fitzwilliam's wife, had sheltered her. She gave birth to Alara Rose. Jedediah Black never knew. Shortly after, with their help, she'd made her way west, as far from West Virginia as she could get, eventually settling in South Dakota, always hoping, always searching for news of Elias, but too afraid to use her real name for many years. She'd eventually married a kind man who adopted Alara. Clara had passed away in the 1990s, never knowing her beloved brother was alive, living just a few counties away under an assumed name. Alara, her daughter, had continued the quiet search. But without knowing Elias had changed his name, she'd found nothing. Grace, Alara's daughter, knew the vague family story of a lost great-uncle, a tragedy in a mining town. But she never dreamed anyone would come looking for them. The reunion, there on that porch, was something I'll never forget. Tears, laughter, decades of unspoken grief and longing pouring out. Grace invited us in, and we talked for hours. She brought out old photographs of Clara, of Alara. The resemblance to our side of the family was undeniable. It was like finding a missing piece of our own hearts, and then the final piece of Grandpa Elias's letter made sense. Tucked into the very end, almost as an afterthought, he'd written, in my old strong box, in the back of my closet, there's a little something I've saved over the years. If you ever find Clara or her kin, it's for them. It's not much, but it's what I could scrape together. A small token for all the lost years. Back at Grandpa's house, we found the strong box. It wasn't a grand treasure chest. Inside there were sacks of neatly bundled cash, not millions, but a considerable sum for a man of his modest means. Savings bonds, and a simple handwritten note for Clara or her children. May this bring some comfort. With all my love, your brother, Elias. He'd been saving it his whole life, a secret hope chest for a family he wasn't sure he'd ever find. It wasn't just money. It was 80 years of love, regret, and hope, all bundled up. We made sure Grace received it, of course. It wasn't about the money for her or for us. It was about the connection, about knowing, about healing wounds that had festered for generations. In the months that followed, our families grew together. We shared holidays, stories, memories. Grace and her children became as much a part of our lives as if we'd known them forever. Grandpa Elias, or Arthur, whatever name he went by, would have been overjoyed. His deepest wish had come true. His Clara's family was found, and they were wonderful. His sacrifice, his long, secret life, it all finally made a painful, beautiful kind of sense. He hadn't just protected Clara. He'd unknowingly paved the way for a legacy of love that bridged generations and healed old sorrows. His secret, once a source of shock and confusion, became a testament to his incredible courage. An enduring love, and that, my friends, is the story of my 99-year-old grandpa's letter. It shook our world, all right, but in the end, it pieced it back together in a way we never could have imagined, stronger and more complete than before. So, what do you think? It's a heck of a story, isn't it? Would you have gone searching? Or would you have let sleeping dogs lie? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more Tales from this old heart. You never know what secrets might be hiding in your own family tree.